Good evening, everyone. I'm Rob Woolsey, a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides and owner-operator of Woolsey's War Walks. And today we're going to be talking about Canada and Flanders and the Battle of Sanctuary Wood. Anything I mention here, MFS is not affiliated with any of the products, companies, apps named in this presentation, and they're not sponsored by, do not endorse, sponsor anything that I talk about. Everything I talk about is my recommendations to you as a guide. So this is our overview. What we're going to be talking about is some overview of the country of Belgium, because that's what we're talking about today. We're taking a look at recommended preparations, some travel advisories, helpful words, some places you can try to eat in the area, some places to stay, good ideas that you might want to do, some transportation you might want to consider. We're going to talk about Ypres, Canadians in the Ypres Salient, and then we're specifically going to be talking about the end of May, beginning of June 1916, and the action in Sanctuary Wood. So Belgium, we're in the region of West Flanders, is where the town of Ypres is, and the Ypres Salient, which was a major battlefield of the First World War. It's only about 20 square kilometers, and it was heavily fought over for the entirety of the war, with 5 different battles named after it. Population of the area is about 1.2 million people. They actually speak Flemish. They don't speak French. Interesting point of note, all the maps from the First World War have French names, and the people there are all Flemish, and they don't speak French. The closest international airport is, of course, Brussels, and then there's also Brussels-Charleroi, which is close as a regional airport for smaller airlines. Belgium is the 10th most expensive country in the world, so it's higher than the average. Ypres was known for its cloth trade from the 1300s and is an old Vauban star fort, and it's a magnificent place, but it was heavily smashed in the First World War, and it took from 1918 to 1968 to rebuild. Again, it's about 24 square kilometers. Active battlefield, 5 different Battle of Ypres, 1914, 15, 17, and 2 different battles in 1918, as well as smaller, countless actions and less well-known ones, including the one we're talking about today. It is known for its high number of cemeteries in that 24 square kilometers. There's about 303 of them, and there's a ton of memorials. There's memorials to the missing, there's memorials to unit actions, and Canada, in fact, has 3 different memorials in the salient, plus the Menin Gate, and John McCrae's bunker is there. So Belgium generally has a fairly mild climate. It's pretty awesome that way. It's cooler and wetter in the fall and the winters and into early spring, but warm, dry summers. Best time to travel really is the end of April to about the beginning, middle of November. You have to be careful by getting to that date. That's when it starts to get really quite rainy. Always bring a rain jacket. You never know. It's not super far from the sea. Weather changes. It's also a good windbreaker. Parts of Belgium are very flat, and the wind can be quite gusty there. Always travel with travel and medical insurance when you're going. Everywhere in that area is child friendly and pet friendly. But please remember, these are memorials and cemeteries, and so a lot of these things are in towns and in people's yards and in people's properties. So you have to kind of be cognizant of the fact that this is their home and where they live. And unfortunately, there's no city passes in and around that part of Ypres at all. So always check your travel, Government of Canada travel advice for Belgium. It's a great little country, but it has its challenges. Okay, so there's no COVID requirements. Visa entry, there's none if you're coming from the EU, but it's a maximum 90-day stay inside of the EU if you're coming from Canada. Petty crime is a risk, but Ypres is a really safe town. It's fairly small, kind of niche. It's got a huge tourist market, so they do a very good job dealing with the petty crime. Ypres does have its hospital. 112 is its emergency number. And of course, the only consular embassy in Belgium is in Brussels. So helpful tips. This is very important. The picture on the top is one that I have I found when I almost stepped on it. So battle areas were very well cleaned up, especially in Belgium, but there's still lots of unexploded ordnance that litters the field. Don't touch it, stay away from it. It's becoming more unstable over time. There was an incident in September, actually in the Ypres Salient, not far from where we're talking. A farmer picked up and moved a shell because he knew it was dangerous and he was trying to plow. Turned out it was full of mustard gas and he got very badly burned. So something to be aware of. Always have good footwear. Lots of sites have stone paths, but a lot of cemeteries and battlefield locations are either fields, farm tracks, or very muddy. So you don't want to be walking around in kind of poor footwear, flip-flops, or sandals. You want good shoes. And you're going to be walking to some of these places. Also, be aware of some of the divots and holes around you because they're actually mined in shell craters. It might just look like a slight depression. I'll give you an example. The bottom photo is the town of Saint Eloi. It looks like a wonderful little lake in the middle of the town. And that's actually a mine crater that got blown up in the middle of the town on the front line in 1916. So they're also very deep and very dangerous, right? Because they're filled with water and who knows what's at the bottom of them. That's one of the challenges of it. So we're going to talk about the Battle of Montserrat. And that's actually the whole overarching battle. It's also called Hill 62 Sanctuary Wood. We're going to talk about the northern part of this battle, the Battle of Sanctuary Wood itself. So the Canadian Corps, by May of 1916, had three divisions, all commanded by Canadian generals. Major General Arthur Currie was in command of the 1st Canadian Division. Major General Richard Turner, VC, was commanding the 2nd Canadian Division, and the newly built and organized 3rd Canadian Division was under Toronto lawyer Major General Malcolm Mercer. The Canadian Corps was under the command of Edwin Alderson, a lieutenant general who was British at the time and had been in the Ypres Salient in various locations since the spring of 1915, but had only participated in minor actions and holding the line and doing training. The Canadian Corps headquarters experienced some change in May of 1916, which would set into motion some of the greatest accomplishments for Canada of the Great War. And that was the change of commanders from Lieutenant General Alderson to Lieutenant General Julian Byng. The change was made because of political reasons more than military ones, but the impact would soon be felt. Julian Byng was an experienced cavalry officer, and I would say experienced. He was hugely experienced, having fought in South Africa in the Boer War, but also having commanded the 3rd Cavalry Division at the start of the war, and then the Cavalry Corps, then transferred to the 9th Infantry Corps at Gallipoli and fought there and successfully withdrew it. And then finally, 17th Corps back on the Western Front, all British units, before suddenly and unexpectedly being ordered to take command of the Canadian Corps. To which he remarked he knew nothing about Canada or Canadians, and he was promptly told to go to the Canadian Corps. He took over at the very end of May 1916, with his troops holding the line from the hamlet of Hooge in the north along the Menin Road, all the way southward in a giant arc to as far south as Hill 60, the last ridge line on the eastern flank of the Ypres Salient. The Canadian Corps at the time didn't have the greatest reputation. By May of 1916, its performance at the Second Battle of Ypres the year before was good, but not great, mostly based on very poor leadership by some of the commanders, and its actions in the fall of 1915 were at best haphazard, poorly led, bad training, bad equipment, and some real blunders ended up hammering the Canadians' reputation. And by March of 1916, when the 2nd Canadian Division's attack at St. Eloi craters failed miserably, it led to severe criticism of the Canadians. Now holding the line, all 3 divisions, the 2nd in the south, the 1st in the middle, and the 3rd in the very north, between the village of Hooge and the feature called Montserrat. And if you look at this map, Montserrat is at the bottom. And so if you look at the left-hand map, so that is where we're going to be talking about today. So here are the trench maps. I'm going to point out this is the British front line is in the blue. The yellow teardrop thing is where the Canadian Memorial is today at Hill 62. And behind it is another feature. The yellow flag is Canadian Memorial and Observatory Ridge we'll talk about later. And the other yellow dot near Maple Copse on the map on the right, or left, sorry, is the Canadian Cemetery that we're going to talk about in a later battle as part of the fighting. But we're talking Sanctuary Wood, which is the top part of that map. The left-hand map is actually the trenches that were in most of the front line. It's actually the numbers and names of all of the trenches where a lot of the fighting took place. This 3rd Canadian Division was the newest, and in fact, it was so new that its artillery was not fully formed and was supported by a British artillery unit of the 3rd Lahore Division of the British Indian Army. It was also the only division formed not in Canada or the United Kingdom, but it was pulled together from various units already in France. Made up of 3 infantry brigades, the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade consisted of the Royal Canadian Regiment, recently arrived from Bermuda, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, who had transferred in from the British 28th Division, the 42nd Royal Highlanders of Canada Battalion, and the 49th Edmonton Battalion, who would both have been brought over as corps troops to support the Canadian Corps. The 8th Canadian Brigade was made up of 4 battalions of the Canadian Mounted Rifles, 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th, which had been converted from their role as mounted troops into infantry after their dismal performance in late 1915. The 9th Canadian Brigade, made up of the 43rd Cameron Highlanders, 52nd Northern Ontario, 58th Central Ontario, and 60th Victoria Rifles of Canada battalions, all came across from England, formed their brigade, and joined the division. The area between Hooge and a feature called Tortop was held by the 7th Brigade's RCR in the north, and in Sanctuary Wood by the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, with the 42nd Royal Highlanders behind them in support, but covering an area to their south behind 8th Brigade's lines, not behind the 7th Brigade lines, because the brigade commander, Brigadier Archibald MacDonnell, realized that the critical area was not his heavily wooded sector, but where the 8th Canadian Brigade was, and if the Germans attacked, they would smash right through it. All but one of his battalions was in the line. The 49th Edmonton Battalion, led by the mayor of Edmonton, Willie Griesbaugh, was back in reserve just outside the city gates of Ypres. Sanctuary Wood was well named, as it had not been smashed or destroyed in battle, and it was covered with trees, and it still stood mostly intact. It was also a place where troops could rest unseen, and therefore undisturbed. The problem was that there was not that many troops in Ypres Salient by the end of May 1916, because the British were building up in the south on the Somme region for the attack that was to take place on the 1st of July. The Germans knew about this attack. There was no way to hide it, so they decided that they would launch a disrupting attack would be a great idea, and they would choose this quiet, inactive sector in Belgium, knowing that the British would have to retake the ground. Their preparations included many tunneling and mining operations, bringing forward artillery, and practicing over mock-up trenches of the Canadian lines. Interestingly, all of this was observed by the British and the Canadians, and specifically the 8th Canadian Brigade, who overlooked them, but they did nothing to disrupt it and thought nothing was out of the ordinary. When General Byng took over, he was not pleased with his positions in the north, and he ordered the divisional commander, Major Mercer, to plan an attack to push the Germans back off the ground and a little bit further east, making the ridgeline less vulnerable. Byng had planned to go forward with Malcolm Mercer, but changed his mind at the last minute due to other pressing matters. Early on the morning of the 2nd of June, 1916, Major General Mercer went forward into the 8th Brigade area and met with the 8th Brigade commander, Brigadier General Victor Williams, the man who in fact built Camp Valcartier. The two were going to move up to the 1st and 4th Canadian Mounted Rifle positions and do a reconnaissance in preparation for the very first attack by the Canadian Corps. The Germans, unknowingly, had timed their start of their attack almost perfectly. They began their bombardment, and it smashed into the 8th Canadian Brigade's 1st and 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles lines, but critically wounded Brigadier Williams and mortally wounded Brigadier General Mercer, thus cutting off the top of the chain of command in the sector that was the most vulnerable and the most vital. All along the 3rd Canadian Division line, many positions were hit, and practically 1st and 4th Battalion Canadian Mounted Rifles were destroyed in place. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantries were relatively newly arrived, only arriving on the 1st of June. Their number 1 company under Major Jones and number 2 company under Captain Niven, Military Cross recipient, were in the very front line, with number 3 and number 4 companies under Major Gray and Lieutenant DeBay were in support. What was interesting about these positions was that number 4 company also was not covering the back of the other Patricia companies, but was practically behind 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles, holding that critical ground because the commander of the PPCLI, Colonel Buller, also thought that the 8th Canadian Brigade would cave if they were attacked. The attack had become as a complete surprise. The Patricias noted there had been ranging fire placed upon them in Sanctuary Wood, but nothing serious. They felt secure in their trench lines, and they had no indication what was to come, even though many signs had been clearly seen in other sectors. The artillery bombardment started early, but by 9 a.m., it had reached its full force, hammering the Canadian front line and support lines, in particular, as I said, the 8th Brigade. This lasted for 4 hours, preventing any reinforcements from moving up, and Canadian counterfire was completely ineffective. The 42nd Royal Highlanders and 49th Edmonton Battalion, were told to stand to at 10 a.m. along with the 2nd and 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles of 8th Brigade. 9th Brigade, further back, was also told to move forward, but then the telephone lines were cut and all communication was lost on the front line. The main attack began when the Germans detonated 4 mines under 8th Canadian Brigade front lines at 1 p.m. and then swarmed over their positions with 5 battalions of infantry, with 4 more coming up behind them. The PPCLI and Sanctuary Wood took a terrible beating. Major Jones was quickly mortally wounded, and an entire platoon was annihilated with flamethrowers as the Germans came over the top. All over the attack, very few officers and senior NCOs survived. In number 1 company, all were lost, and what few survivors from the company held on were overrun and completely annihilated or captured. The other company, number 2 company, under Captain Niven, held on, and even though they were cut off by German infantry swarming around either side of their positions in the north, they held out for 18 hours, defending and shooting into the Germans as they advanced. Every officer was killed or wounded, Captain Niven actually being wounded very early in the action leading his men. But they held on, pouring fire into the Germans along their advancing flanks, but they held back, fighting from trench to trench, position to position. Number 3 company had lost about half its men when the CO of the battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Buller, realized where the main blow would fall in his sector. And so he focused all of his efforts there, pouring men into the gaps and into the trenches. He led from the front. Number 4 company had lost its company commander, mortally wounded early in his reinforcement attempt, and the fierceness of the fighting between the PPCLI and the 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles filling into maple copse was vicious. The 42nd Battalion reinforcements, a couple of companies, came up to help plug the line just as Colonel Buller jumped up on the parapet to help rally the troops and to see where the next thrust would fall, only to be cut down by German fire. By 3 p.m., the main effort for the Germans was over, and almost every officer in the PPCLI was a casualty. The fighting had cost the regiment about 400 total men lost, of which 150 were killed. While the PPCLI held the line, the 49th moved up to do a counterattack that had been ordered by General Byng, who was furious about what had happened. Nothing was known about the fate of Major General Mercer, and, along with now the 52nd Battalion commander, who went missing as he moved forward, the counterattack began to stall. The 43rd Battalion also came up, but it was hampered by casualties, artillery fire, and confusion. The attack was planned to be coordinated with the 1st Canadians Division to push and retake the lost ground by 8th Brigade, and it was begin at 2 a.m. on the 3rd of June, and it was a complete disaster. All the units were meant to attack together at the same time, and this did not happen because signal rockets that were firing didn't go off, misfired, or didn't get fired at all. As I said, the 52nd Battalion stalled completely as its CO disappeared in the rear area and is still listed as missing in action today. Only the 49th Battalion was actually successful of all the battalions attacking. They were able to take all the support and reserve positions inside of Sanctuary Wood, but not able to recapture the full front line. The CO, William Griesbach, was furious with the other battalions of his brigade, of the divisions, for their lack of determination and effort, which left him the only unit to get to his objectives and had suffered a terrible cost. With the buildup in the Somme, resources were now limited, and the Canadians were ordered to recover their old positions, as the Germans were now only 2 miles from Ypres and on the high ground to the east and put the town very much at risk. But they were to be given no extra help or extra support. They had to do it on their own. A much better plan for counterattack was put together by Major General Arthur Currie, commander of the 1st Canadian Division. He would use units and resources from all 3 divisions. The 2nd Canadian Division 6th Brigade came into line at Hooge in the north to help shore up what was left of the 3rd Division, and the 9th Brigade of 3rd Division put itself into Sanctuary Wood, which was left of the 7th Brigade pulling back, and the shattered 8th Brigade was only about a couple hundred men. The 1st Canadian Division put the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade of the 1st Division into line to help recover Hill 62. The plan was very thorough. Arthur Currie had artillery prepared that brought all 218 guns of the corps into action. The intent was to fire several bombardments, over the preceding days as the weather turned poor and started to rain, so that he would trick the Germans into thinking they would be always counterattacked and lull them into a false sense of security, which is exactly what he did. Random 30-minute, hour-long bombardages and bombardments on various parts of the line to convince the Germans something was going to happen. And it happened over that entire rainy week, making it more miserable for the Germans as they weren't able to reinforce and dig in, and the weather was hurting them. The 12th of June opened with an unremitting bombardment of German lines, focusing on the flanks to shatter any hope of stopping counterattacks and smashing machine guns. The infantry attack would be led by Arthur Currie, with his 2nd Brigade, Brigadier General Louis Lipsett, commanding the 1st, 3rd, 7th, and 8th Battalions, and the 2nd Brigade, under Brigadier General Tuxford, using the 2nd, 4th, 13th, and 16th Battalion. Their focus was to recapture Observatory Ridge and Hill 62 in the north. At Sanctuary Wood, the 58th Battalion from 9th Brigade and the 52nd Battalion remnants were to clear the rest of the wood and regain the lost ground. At 8:30 p.m. on the 12th of June, 1916, the last intense shelling began, and the infantry started moving into their start positions. Adding to it, smoke shell and a blinding rainstorm made visibility for the Germans near impossible. When the attack was finally ordered in the middle of the night, the infantry surged forward, and they quickly regained the lost ground, meeting shattered German defenders. The northern attack was so quick, in fact, that it was over within an hour and a half. The 13th Battalion, the Black Watch, retook Hill 62 itself, and the original front line was regained in almost all locations. The southern half also quickly gained ground, with only minor checks for some stubborn defenders, specifically around Mount Sorel itself. All began to dig in and consolidate, which they completed by early morning on the 13th of June, just in time for the Germans to launch 2 determined counterattacks, which came in over the next day and a half, finally ending the battle on the 14th of June, 1916. For the Canadians, the battle lasted from the 2nd to the 13th of June, over a very small section of the Ypres Salient, and was very costly. In total, all units that fought there from Canada suffered 8,000 casualties, and the Germans about 6,000. What's more tragic about this fighting is that almost no ground changed hands. The Canadians ended up where they were 14 days before, but at a terrible, terrible cost. So here are some of the scenes of the battle scene. Now, there's a reserve trench at Mount Sorel. They say it's Mount Sorel or Sanctuary Wood. There's a series of pictures. They've been captioned as both. It's probably one of the woods around there, but you can see the trench is fairly dry. It's not muddy, and it's fairly deep. And the troops are wearing helmets. So those are Canadians. And you know they're Canadians because the rifles are Ross rifles, because that's the weapon we were still fighting with. The picture on the top right was 2 guns that the Canadians had put in the front line with the mounted rifles. They were called the sacrifice guns, and they fought until the entire gun crews were killed. They were the only 2 artillery pieces Canada lost in the First World War, captured by the Germans, and the Germans forgot to pull them out. And so when the Canadians counterattacked, they retook their guns. The bottom trench is a Canadian soldier being hit near a German he's actually being wounded. It's one of a series of photos by a German bombardment near Mont Sorel. The date is June of 1916, so when exactly his date is unknown, but it's roughly in the state of the fighting. But you can see it's not a very well-developed trench, so it's likely one of the ones that was consolidated. And that's the 13th Battalion on the bottom right-hand corner, the Black Watch, digging in at Hill 62 they just captured on the 13th of June. And they're trying to reverse the trench from what the Germans had done, reversing the Canadian trench. They were trying to undo it. It's interesting that you know it's that Black Watch because the man in the back has a very large tam on his head. And that was their headdress. And if you look very carefully, the man in the front of the photo with the shovel in his hand in dirt is wearing a kilt. So what can you see today? Well, that's what's interesting about Sanctuary Wood. There is a lot to see. This battlefield has lots and lots of things you can walk around and see. So, first of all, there's one of the Canadian memorials at Sanctuary Wood. That's the center photo. And it talks about the people who fought there from in the Ypres Salient, April to August 1916. It's at the very top of Hill 62. It's an absolutely beautiful monument, and you walk down, you can look over where the German lines were and parts of the Canadian positions from there. And you can actually see into Maple Copse Cemetery. There's also a museum just behind the memorial called Sanctuary Wood Museum, and it has preserved trench lines from the First World War. It's a little cafe. There's lots of war remnants in there. You can check it out. It's really super cool. But those are the trench lines in the top left photo, and those are preserved trenches from the First World War. And those are the trenches that the PPCLI were helping defend, and the ones on the other side of the road, which aren't preserved, unfortunately, they're on private land. But all of that position was the PPCLI support positions behind 8th Canadian Brigade. So this is where they were fighting, and some of the PPCLI were in action. There's several cemeteries nearby. There's three that I need to really mention. The first one is, of course, there's one called Sanctuary Wood Cemetery. It's actually it's a combination of three cemeteries. There was one there in the war, and then they took the remains of two that were destroyed or damaged and put them all together. And because some of them were so badly damaged in later fighting. So that Sanctuary Wood Museum, or Sanctuary Wood Cemetery, sorry, it's got about 2,200 people in it. When you're looking down from from the memorial, and you're looking down towards the Canadian lines and 8th Canadian Brigade's positions in more detail, you can actually look into Maple Copse Cemetery and into Maple Copse, where we're going to talk about that next month, which is the fighting at Mount Sorel itself, and the 8th Canadian Brigade's piece in the battle. And that's that top center photo. So it's a really quiet, out of the way cemetery. There's actually fighting in that cemetery during the battle. And so it's all special memorials. It's a rebuilt of a ton. They know people were buried there. They were never able to fully recover them, but they know they were there. And so it's full of special memorials, and it's a unique kind of cemetery because there's also people they did find and identify. The other one that you can see, you see it approaching the battlefield. You come at it from the Canadian rear area. Is called Hooge craters. Part of the battle, the Germans also blew up 4 mines under 6th Canadian Brigade, almost destroying a Canadian infantry battalion. And it's a massive 4,000-man cemetery at Hooge craters, and it's along the Menin Road, and you can see it. You can't see it from the memorial, but you can see the ridge line that the memorial is on through the woods from that, and it's a massive cemetery with lots of Canadians in it. The last one I want to point out is the memorial in the top corner. The 48th Highlanders of Canada, at the time the 15th Battalion 48th Highlanders of Canada, had put up a whole series of memorials around the battlefields in the last 20 years. And this is one of them. They fought on Observatory Ridge, where this memorial is. It's not far from Maple Copse. And I discovered it because I was driving with my wife and my kids. We were exploring the battlefield, and my wife said, "There's a Canada flag in the middle of that field." And I said, "There's no way there's a Canada flag in the middle of a farm field. That's silly." And we turned the corner, and there was a giant Canada flag in the middle of a cornfield with a giant Canadian memorial there. And so you can actually see where they fought, and that was their memorial marker on the advance to help retake the ridgeline. So I was proven very, very wrong, and that's one of the photos from there. So it's kind of neat. So other interesting facts from this battle, there's lots of soldiers that were taken farther back. The PPCLI is listed on the Menin Gate. Many of the soldiers that weren't recovered are, of course, around the Menin Gate. But Major General Malcolm Mercer, when he was killed, his body wasn't recovered until the 23rd of June when they were doing cleanup. And he was buried much further back in the cemetery, along with many of the soldiers who died at their wounds. The fields where the Canadians actually held on in their rear lines are all farms again today, and you can drive through them. But you still do see the remains of bunkers and things like that. You can also see some of the mine craters at Hooge, and there's also a cemetery at Burr Crossroads, which was an entry point for Canadian reinforcements coming forward to Sanctuary Woods, and there's some Canadians there. The other interesting thing about this battle is Hill 62 Sanctuary Wood was originally where Vimy Ridge Memorial was to be built. Arthur Currie had his moments as a vain man sometimes, was the Corps commander, and had recommended it go there because that was the very first attack ever by the Canadian Corps going in. And of course, he led it. Unfortunately, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King argued that Vimy Ridge was a better spot because that's where all 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time and only time. And at this time, the Battle of Mount Sorel, the 4th Division, didn't exist. So it would have been an interesting place to have it in Belgium, but it's a battle that most people don't know about. We don't talk about very much because it wasn't one of Canada's most successful or glamorous battles. It was the battle where the highest ranking Canadian ever killed in action was. And it's a great one you can visit, and it's an easy to walk drive, and it's very close to Ypres. Thank you very much.